Hello, in this video I'm going to give you an introduction to the book of the Bible that's called Numbers. Now Numbers is particularly about how God punishes his people for their disobedience and yet continues to promise to bring them into their own land. In the book of Numbers, we're continuing the story of God's people, how God had rescued them from Egypt in the book of Exodus, and now how he's bringing them into their homeland, which we'll see in the book of Joshua. So in Numbers, God's people journey from Mount Sinai to the border of the Promised Land. But then they go through a long period of wandering, and then finally they spend some time on the plains of Moab, outside the Promised Land. So we're getting sort of the end part of their journey, but they don't yet enter the Promised Land. In Numbers, we learn a lot about God. We see that God judges and he punishes his sinful people. But we also see that even though God's people are unfaithful, God continues to show grace and patience, and he remains faithful to his people and his purposes. These things that we see about God, his justice and his mercy and his faithfulness, these things should move God's people to trust him, to obey him. We have some big events in the book of Numbers, and the biggest one is the spies going to explore the land of Canaan, bringing back their report, and then the people rebelling, saying that, no, we won't enter this land, we can't do it. And so God punishes the people for not trusting him, for rebelling against him. But God also continues to promise that he'll bring the people into the land. He'll bring the next generation into their new home. There's also a census that's taken to count the people at the beginning and then toward the end of the book. And it's from those censuses that we get the name of the book, Numbers. In addition to these really big events, there's some famous stories that you'll encounter as you read the book of Numbers. God gives the priestly or Aaronic blessing that we often hear at the end of church services. There's the rebellion of Korah and Dathan and Abiram, and then Aaron's staff buds as a sign that God has chosen Aaron. There's a story of Moses striking the rock instead of speaking to it, and God bringing judgment because of that. There's the story of the bronze snake, and then finally there's the fantastic story of Balaam and his donkey. Now, as always, when we read a book of Numbers, like any book of the Bible, we want to think about Jesus. And thinking about Jesus from the book of Numbers, we see how Jesus took up the punishment for our sins and our disobedience so that we can enter into God's promised rest. So what might Numbers mean for us? Well, we don't have to worry about facing punishment as God's people, because Jesus has taken all of our punishment. But still, we do experience God's discipline, God's guidance. Not everything goes well for us. God allows us to go through consequences. And we should accept these things as God's ways of preparing us for and also bringing us toward the peace and rest that he plans for us. God continues to shape us with his justice and mercy and faithfulness. So those are some things that you can keep in mind as you read the book of Numbers, and maybe also some things that you can look for as you're doing your reading. Now, if you have any questions, or if you want to take some time to talk about what you're learning, what God is saying to you, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd love to talk to you about Numbers. Enjoy your reading.